Walk into the fertilizer aisle in early summer, and the bloom booster products take over an entire section of shelf space. Bright packaging, a high middle number on the NPK ratio, photographs of tomato plants buried under so much fruit the stems look ready to snap. The pitch is almost always the same. More phosphorus, more flowers, more fruit. $20, $25 a bag, sometimes more for the premium versions. And for a meaningful percentage of the gardeners who buy that bag, because their tomato plant is covered in yellow flowers that keep falling to the ground before a single fruit forms, that purchase solves nothing. Not because the product is fraudulent, not because phosphorus is unimportant, but because in the specific scenario printed right there on so many garden center shelves every June and July, a true soil phosphorus deficiency is rarely the actual cause of the dropping flowers, and a bag built to deliver more phosphorus cannot fix a problem that was never about phosphorus scarcity in the first place. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because the economics behind it explain a meaningful share of why gardening advice in this specific category stays so consistently vague. A product built around solving blossom drop in general terms without specifying the actual mechanism can be marketed to nearly every gardener experiencing the symptom, regardless of what is actually causing it in their particular garden. A product specific enough to say, "This only helps if your soil temperature is currently above 85 degrees during flowering," would sell to a much smaller, more precisely defined audience on a much narrower seasonal window. Vague works better for the shelf. Specific works better for the plant. This video is built entirely around the specific version because blossom drop has several distinct, well-documented causes, and the fix that resolves one of them does essentially nothing for the others. Here is what is actually happening, mechanically, inside a tomato flower when it falls instead of setting fruit, and why the timing of that drop, more than any soil test, is usually the most useful diagnostic clue available. A tomato flower is a self-pollinating structure containing both male and female parts within the same blossom. Pollination happens when pollen from the anthers reaches the stigma, typically triggered by wind movement or the vibration of a bee's wing beats against the flower. Once pollination succeeds, the flower's job is finished, and the plant begins redirecting resources toward developing the fertilized ovary into a fruit. The petals drop on their own at this stage, which gardeners sometimes mistake for blossom drop. But the small green fruit is already visibly forming behind the falling petals. That is normal, successful reproduction, not a problem. True blossom drop looks different. The entire flower, petals and the small structure behind them, falls away together, leaving nothing developing in its place. This happens when pollination never successfully occurred, or when it occurred but the plant aborted the developing fruit due to insufficient resources to support it. Both pathways trace back to a short list of specific, identifiable causes, and distinguishing between them is the entire key to choosing a fix that actually works. The most common cause, and the one most frequently missed entirely, is temperature stress at the moment of flowering, not at any other point in the plant's life. Tomato pollen becomes non-viable, meaning it can no longer successfully fertilize an ovary even if it physically reaches the stigma, once nighttime temperatures rise consistently above approximately 75 degrees Fahrenheit, or daytime temperatures exceed roughly 95 degrees during the flowering window. This is documented extensively in university extension research on tomato fruit set failure during heat waves. The mechanism is biological, not chemical. No fertilizer formulation corrects pollen viability lost to heat stress because the problem is not a missing nutrient. It is a temperature threshold the plant's reproductive biology cannot currently tolerate. A bag of bloom booster applied during a heat wave will not bring back fruit set because the actual constraint sits entirely outside the realm of what any fertilizer addresses. The second major cause is genuine nutrient imbalance, but it runs in the opposite direction from what the bloom booster aisle implies for most home gardens. Excess nitrogen, not phosphorus deficiency, is the more common nutrient-driven cause of blossom drop in backyard vegetable gardens. Nitrogen drives vegetative growth, leaves, stems, and overall plant size. A plant receiving more nitrogen than it needs channels its available resources disproportionately into leaf and stem production at the direct expense of reproductive investment, producing a plant that looks lush, dense, and impressively green while setting comparatively little fruit. This happens with notable frequency in gardens using all-purpose lawn fertilizer, which is heavily nitrogen-weighted, applied near vegetable beds, or in gardens over-applying nitrogen-rich amendments like fresh manure or excessive compost without balancing potassium and phosphorus. The fix here is not adding more of anything. It is reducing nitrogen input and allowing the plant's internal resource allocation to shift back toward reproduction once the nitrogen surplus is no longer driving disproportionate vegetative growth, typically over a period of 2 to 3 weeks, as the plant works through its current nitrogen reserves. The third cause, genuinely involving potassium rather than phosphorus, deserves specific mention because potassium deficiency does meaningfully affect flower retention, just through a different mechanism than most bloom booster marketing implies. Potassium regulates the opening and closing of stomata, the microscopic pores on leaf surfaces that control water loss and gas exchange, and it governs the plant's ability to move sugars to wherever they are needed most, including developing flowers and fruit. A potassium-deficient plant struggles to maintain consistent internal water pressure and struggles to direct sugar reserves toward the high-demand task of setting fruit, both of which increase the likelihood that a flower gets abandoned rather than supported through fertilization. This is a real, documented mechanism, and it is the one piece of the bloom booster pitch that has genuine scientific grounding, just frequently mislabeled under a generic phosphorus-forward formulation rather than addressed with a specific mineral actually responsible. The fourth and final major cause is simple physical stress, unrelated to either temperature or nutrition. Inconsistent watering, particularly swings between drought stress and sudden overwatering, which the plant interprets as a signal that current conditions cannot reliably support new fruit development, triggering abortion of recently formed flowers as a self-protective measure. Here is the complete diagnostic and treatment approach, organized by which cause actually applies, because applying the wrong fix here is not merely ineffective, it frequently makes the underlying problem worse. Check the thermometer first, specifically nighttime lows during the period when flowers are forming and falling. If nighttime temperatures have been consistently above 75 degrees, heat stress is very likely the primary driver, and no soil amendment will resolve it. The only effective interventions during a heat wave are providing afternoon shade cloth to reduce ambient temperature around the plant, ensuring consistent deep watering to reduce additional stress, and accepting that fruit set will resume once nighttime temperatures drop back into a tolerable range, typically as the season transitions or during a cooler stretch of weather. This is frustrating advice because it asks for patience rather than a product, but it is the accurate advice. If temperatures have been moderate and the plant looks unusually lush, dense, and dark green with comparatively few flowers attempting to set at all, suspect nitrogen excess. Stop applying any nitrogen-rich fertilizer or fresh compost immediately. If the soil has received recent heavy nitrogen input, a thorough, deep watering can help leach some excess nitrogen below the root zone, though this should be done judiciously to avoid wasting water or creating drainage problems. Expect a 2 to 3 week adjustment period before flower retention improves as the plant's internal nitrogen surplus depletes. If temperatures are moderate, nitrogen input has been reasonable, and the plant shows any signs consistent with potassium deficiency, leaf edges that look slightly scorched or yellowed, fruit that splits as it ripens, stems that seem less rigid than expected, a targeted potassium application is appropriate. A simple homemade approach. Steep 3 to 4 ripe banana peels in a quart of water for 24 to 48 hours. Strain and apply undiluted at the base of the affected plant. Banana peels carry substantial potassium in readily soluble form once steeped, delivering a direct, low-cost correction without the broader nitrogen and phosphorus load that comes bundled into a commercial bloom booster product, whether the plant needs those additional nutrients or not. If watering has been inconsistent, drought stress followed by sudden heavy watering, or the reverse, establish a consistent watering schedule before introducing any additional amendment, since adding fertilizer to a plant under irregular watering stress addresses the wrong variable entirely and can compound the existing problem. The honest summary, the one no $25 bag of bloom booster wants printed on its label, is that blossom drop has at least 4 distinct, well-documented causes, only one of which, potassium deficiency, is reliably addressed by the kind of generic, phosphorus-heavy formulation marketed as the universal solution to dropped flowers. Heat stress requires shade and patience. Nitrogen excess requires restraint and time. Inconsistent watering requires a schedule, not a supplement. Diagnosing which of these is actually occurring in a specific garden by checking the thermometer, observing the plant's vegetative density, watching the watering pattern, and only then considering a targeted potassium correction if the other 3 have been ruled out, costs nothing and takes less time than a single trip to the garden center. For anyone standing over a tomato plant covered in flowers that keep falling before a single fruit sets, the diagnostic sequence above will identify which of the 4 causes applies far more reliably than any bag on any shelf, because the bag was never built to ask which cause is actually present in this specific garden, this specific week, under this specific weather. It was built to be purchased by as many gardeners as possible, regardless of which version of the problem they actually have. If this kind of precise, mechanism-first reasoning is what brought you to Rooted Grace, the like button and the subscribe bell keep this work going every week. Drop a comment below describing your blossom drop, what the nighttime temperatures have looked like, how lush the plant looks, and your recent watering pattern, and I will help you work through which of these 4 causes is the most likely culprit in your specific garden. This wraps the diagnostic mini-series that started with magnesium and iron. The next video in this series returns to a complete recipe building on everything covered across these diagnostic videos into one preventive feeding schedule that addresses most of these deficiencies before they ever show up as a visible symptom. That one is coming next week. Until then, check the thermometer before the shelf and let the plant's own pattern tell you what it actually needs.